Good morning. Welcome to the fifth lesson in our series on the history of the Bible. In the first unit of our study, Inspiration, we examined the evidence supporting our conviction that the Bible is the very Word of God, revealed to human authors who wrote it down as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. In Unit 2, Canon, we learned why we can be confident that the Bible is the complete Word of God, containing only the books and all of the books that were written through the process of inspiration. In this third unit, Textual Transmission, we will address the question, can we be confident that the original language texts from which our English Bible are translated are accurate and reliable representatives of the original inspired documents? This is a poster that was published by the National Archives and Records Administration. That's the government agency charged with preserving and documenting government and historical records. And its message is pretty straightforward. Important information, regardless of its source, is best preserved in written form. Now, I'll be honest, I first spotted this poster on television in an episode of NCIS. And so from now on, I'm going to count all of my binge watching of NCIS as lesson preparation. But this chart is a perfect introduction to this unit of our study because it sets the spirit for what we're talking about. After inspiration and canonization, then, the third link in the chain of communication from God to us is the process of transmitting the biblical text from generation to generation and from culture to culture. Until the invention of movable type in 1450, literary texts were reproducible only through handwritten copies. The original manuscripts of the scriptures, which are called autographs, went through decades, possibly centuries, of being copied for distribution to churches throughout and eventually beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. Inevitably, human error on the part of the scribes resulted in some corruption of the original texts in the copies that were made from these autographs. No two copies of an autograph manuscript would have been exactly alike because each would bear its own scribe's errors. And then as the original autograph manuscripts wore out and became unusable, all future manuscripts had to be made from these existing copies. And each succeeding generation of manuscript copies not only preserved the scribal errors that had been passed down to them, but they added new ones of their own. Add several other complicating factors into the mix, and the result is thousands of instances of disagreement and discrepancies between the ancient manuscripts. So it is reasonable to ask, how much have the original books of the Bible been corrupted by scribal errors over centuries of copying and recopying? And since our English Bibles have been translated from manuscript copies that were hundreds of years removed from the original autographs, how can we be sure that they are faithful and reliable witnesses to what the original authors wrote thousands of years ago? There is an entire branch of scholarship devoted to dealing with precisely such textual questions. It's the academic discipline known as textual criticism. The first step in the text critical process is to collect as many ancient manuscripts as we can find of the biblical documents. Step 2 is to analyze and compare the discrepancies between these manuscripts. The discrepancies are called variants in the technical lingo of textual criticism. So we want to compare these discrepancies, and then through a process of asking questions and evaluating the various manuscripts according to specific rules or canons, that's a good use of the word, canons of criticism, the textual critic attempts to deduce the most likely reading of the original autographs. Some of these criteria or canons of textual criticism are, for instance, if we have two variant manuscript readings, usually the reading of the older manuscript is to be preferred because it's closer in time to the original autograph. If we have two variant manuscript readings, in general, the shorter reading is to be preferred because scribes are more likely to add than to delete text. And of two variant manuscript readings, the more difficult reading is to be preferred because it would be more likely to have been corrected or cleared up by later copyists rather than to be made more obtruse. Another one is where two variant manuscript readings are distributed among a number of manuscripts. The majority reading is to be preferred unless the minority reading occurs in older manuscripts, while the majority reading occurs primarily in later manuscripts. So these are just a few of the canons of textual criticism. Now, sometimes they conflict with each other, and so the critic has to make a choice. The task of textual criticism can be quite difficult at times, but fortunately, the vast majority of the textual variants that are before us in the total body of New Testament manuscripts, common mistakes of misspelled words, inverted letters, omission or duplication of words or short phrases, things that with enough manuscripts to compare to one another, they're mistakes that can easily be recognized and corrected. So, the more evidence we have, the more copies that we have of the text of the Bible, the more likely we are to be able to arrive at the original text or very, very close to it. The evidence for the original text of the Bible is arranged into three primary categories. First is original language manuscripts. This consists of handwritten copies of biblical books written in their original languages. For the Old Testament, that would be Hebrew, with a small amount in Aramaic. For the New Testament, that would be Greek. Prior to 1947, the oldest known biblical manuscript of any kind were Greek copies of the New Testament. These date practically all the way back to the 1st century, at least in fragmentary form, and to the 4th and 5th centuries AD in complete manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts of the Greek New Testament are documents called uncials. That's a fancy name for capital letters. These manuscripts were written in large capital letters throughout and appear to be the work of highly trained professional scribes. Later manuscripts are called minuscules because they were written in lowercase letters or in a flowing cursive script. And these, many show the marks of having been copied by untrained or very lowly skilled scribes. Some of these Greek manuscripts are written in scrolls, but the vast majority of them are written in the modern book or codex form. The earliest available manuscripts of the Old Testament before 1947 dated to no earlier than AD 1000. That places them at 2,500 to 1,500 years removed from the original autographs. The year 1947 was momentous for Old Testament textual studies. In that year, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls pushed the date of the oldest known Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament back by as much as 1,000 years. One complete scroll of the book of Isaiah from the 4th cave in the Qumran complex dates from about 100 BC. So you can see that we have closed the gap by hundreds of years with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. A second source of manuscript evidence of the text of the scriptures is ancient versions. A version is a translation of a biblical document rendered from its original language into the spoken language of a specific readership. The oldest version of the Old Testament that we have is the Greek Septuagint. That's often referred to by the symbol LXX, or often called the 70. That's based on an old legend that the Septuagint was translated by 70 Jewish scholars. But the translation of the Septuagint began in Alexandria, Egypt, as early as the 3rd century BC. The earliest New Testament versions that we have are the Old Latin and Old Syriac. Both of these versions date from the beginning of the 2nd century AD, just over a generation removed from the original autographs. However, the oldest known manuscript copies that we have of these versions still date only from the 4th or 5th century AD. A third source of manuscript evidence, especially for the New Testament, is what we call patristic citations. These consist of quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the early church fathers. Patristic citations begin in the 1st century and they continue in unbroken succession from that time forward. They provide a valuable source of evidence to the form of the text that was available to scholars and available to the church fathers in the earliest centuries of church history. Now, in the remainder of this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at the existing manuscript witnesses to the text of the Old Testament. First, and of greatest importance, is what we call the Masoretic Text, with manuscripts that date primarily from about AD 1000 to 1200. A few fragments exist that may be as much as 500 years older than that, but they are so fragmentary that they're not very helpful in textual studies. The most valuable evidence we have for the Masoretic Text then dates to about AD 1000. And again, as we noted before, that leaves a time gap of over 1,000 years between the oldest Masoretic Text manuscripts and the autographs themselves. But, be that as it may, the Masoretic Text is the text that underlies most English translations of the Old Testament up to and including the King James Version. The only exceptions to that rule would be those early English translations that were translated from the Latin. So the Masoretic Text is of momentous importance to the history of our English Bible because, for the most part, it underlies our Old Testament. The Masoretic Text gets its name from the elite school of Jewish scribes called Masoretes, who copied them. One of the Masoretes' chief goals was to produce a standard, uniform edition of the Hebrew Old Testament from all the various texts that had been copied, recopied, and passed down through the centuries. So the Masoretes were more than just scribes. They may be fairly recognized as perhaps the first textual critics in history. And as they compared and analyzed the manuscript evidence available to them, they established specific criteria for evaluating and prioritizing the textual variants. And the end result of all of that is what we call the Masoretic Text. Once the Masoretic Text was established, the main concern then was to protect it from becoming corrupted again through the continued scribal process. And so to that end, the Masoretes established numerous safeguards for identifying and correcting scribal errors in future manuscript copies. They meticulously counted every word, even every letter in each book of the Old Testament. In fact, the Hebrew word for scribe, which is sofer, literally means one who counts letters. The Masoretes identified the middle letter of each book of the Old Testament and the middle letter of the entire Old Testament. Eventually, they standardized the arrangement of the letters and words on each page and each line of a manuscript. So each page would become visually familiar to a scribe. And with this statistical data ready at hand, a scribe could evaluate the quality of a newly produced manuscript just by counting the words or the letters on a line or a page or within an entire book. And he could scan for irregularities just simply in the arrangement of the text on the page. And any manuscript that didn't pass all of these rigorous tests was either corrected or it was destroyed, so that its errors would not be perpetuated in subsequent copies. Now, another feature of the Masoretes' work was the development of an exhaustive system of notes and comments on the text, which would inform and assist future generations of scribes. These notes were written on the side and the bottom margins of the pages, which left the appearance of the main text itself unaffected. These notes were called, in Hebrew, Masorah, and thus the name the Masoretes. Now, as to existing copies of the Masoretic Text today, the best representatives we have are called the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. Until 1947, the Aleppo Codex contained the complete text of the Old Testament. And according to its colophon, a colophon is details of production and so forth that are placed at the end of a book or manuscript. According to the colophon of the Aleppo Codex, it was copied by a scribe named Shlomo ben Bayah in about AD 930. The Aleppo Codex was housed for centuries in the synagogue of Aleppo, Syria, hence its name. And for all of those centuries, it was unavailable for study. Now, in 1947, amid the riots that followed the establishment of the modern state of Israel, it was believed that the Codex had been destroyed. Later, however, it was learned that 295 of the original 491 pages of the Codex were saved and kept in a secret hiding place. And in 1958, the remaining portions of the Aleppo Codex were smuggled to Israel, where it was photographed and made available to scholars for the first time. The Leningrad Codex, which also contains the complete Old Testament, was copied in Cairo about AD 1008. And with the partial destruction of the Aleppo Codex, that leaves the Leningrad Codex as the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament known to exist. Today is located in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, which formerly was known as Leningrad, and hence the name of this manuscript. There are other manuscript witnesses to the Masoretic text, but none of them compare in quality or completeness to the Aleppo and the Leningrad codices. Now, another interesting story. In 1890, during the restoration of the ancient synagogue of Ben Ezra in Cairo, a medieval geniza was discovered high on the front wall of a balcony. A geniza was a storeroom for old, unusable scrolls and books. And when the Cairo geniza was opened, it was found to contain some 200,000 manuscripts and fragments, of which about 10,000 were biblical texts. The biblical manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza now rest in collections all over the world. The ones you're looking at here are in the British Museum. Most of the biblical manuscripts from the Geniza belong to the Masoretic Text tradition. As the Masoretic Text was finalized, the older manuscripts were destroyed. And that is the reason for the great paucity of witnesses to the pre-Masoretic texts of the Old Testament. And so a gap of 1,500 years or more separating the Old Testament autographs from the Masoretic text leaves us with a lot of questions. How much was the text of the Old Testament degraded by scribal errors through all those centuries of copying and recopying the manuscripts? How skilled were the Masoretes as textual critics? Could their texts accurately reproduce the primitive texts of the autographs after so many intervening centuries? And how honest were the Masoretes as theologians? Is it possible that they doctored the text to any degree to reflect any theological or sectarian biases that they might have favored? And finally, since our earliest English versions of the Old Testament are translated from the medieval Masoretic Text, how assured can we really be that what we read is a faithful representation of what Moses and the prophets actually wrote when we read our English Old Testament? To be able to answer these questions, we would need some kind of documentary evidence of the text of the Old Testament before the time of the Masoretes. And as a matter of fact, such evidence actually exists, and that's what we'll be looking at next. There are three primary sources of evidence to the text of the Hebrew Old Testament prior to the time of the Masoretes. And the first, we visited before, is the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament. It's a 3rd century BC translation, and the original Hebrew text from which it was translated is now lost. But the process of back translating the Septuagint provides some evidence to the nature of this underlying text, which predated the Masoretes by as much as 1,000 years. A sample, and a relatively significant sample variant between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, is found in the text of Exodus 12, verses 40 and 41. The Masoretic text of those verses read, and this is the English translation, the New American Standard Bible. Those verses read, "Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." That reflects the Masoretic text of these verses. The Septuagint translation of these verses, as we have it in Greek, would read like this: "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years. And it came to pass after the 430 years, all the forces of the Lord came forth out of the land of Egypt by night." So we can see that these variant texts between the Masoretic and the Septuagint create a 200-year discrepancy in the chronology of the Egyptian bondage and the exodus of the Israelites. According to the Masoretes, the Egyptian bondage lasted 430 years. According to the text from which the Septuagint was translated, apparently that 430 years included not just the Egyptian bondage, but all the time that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived in Canaan as well. And so you can see that that would make a tremendous difference in the dating of events in the Old Testament. And the majority voice of modern Old Testament scholarship favors the reading of the Septuagint over the Masoretic text on this issue. That conclusion, though, is far from unanimous. And personally, I am more inclined to accept the Masoretic reading for a number of reasons, but we don't have time to get into those in this lesson. The value of the Septuagint for evidence to the text of its Hebrew original is somewhat mitigated by a number of factors. For one thing, the Septuagint is not a uniform quality translation. The character of the Greek in the Septuagint ranges from slavishly literal in the Pentateuch to a very free, almost paraphrastic translation in the writings, the Holy Writings. And that affects the quality of its witness to the parent Hebrew text from which it was copied. Secondly, the Septuagint was translated for the needs of the public synagogue worship rather than for the use of academic scholars. So precision wasn't necessarily a high priority for the translators. And third, although the Septuagint does appear to be generally loyal to the readings of the original Hebrew, some have maintained that the Greek-speaking translators were not always very good Hebrew scholars. But that is one of the witnesses we have to the pre-Masoretic form of the Hebrew Scriptures. The second witness we have is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans were a mixed race of people. They arose after 722 BC through the intermarriage of the small remnant of Israelites who were left in the land of Israel following the Assyrian exile with the foreign captives of other nations who were transplanted into Israel. And so these people developed their own unique form of the Israelite religion. One of the unique things about it was that it accepted only the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, as authoritative scripture. They had no regard for the prophets or the holy writings. It is thought by some scholars that the Samaritans used the form of the Pentateuch as it existed at that time. That is, about the time of the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel. But others believe that the Samaritan Pentateuch branched off from the standard texts used in the Jewish temple sometime in the 2nd century BC. But either way, the result was that a second Hebrew recension of the Pentateuch circulated among the Samaritans in the final few centuries before Christ. The Samaritan Pentateuch then contains those 5 books of Moses written in a Paleo-Hebrew script, an archaic script that predated the familiar square script that we associate with the Hebrew language today. But no existing manuscript of the Samaritan Pentateuch is older than the 11th century AD. So even though we may have copies that represent a non-standard text, those copies are not any more helpful to us than the manuscripts of the Masoretic Text because they're so far removed from the originals. In all, there are about 6,000 deviations in the Samaritan Pentateuch from what we read in the Masoretic Text. And many of them, if not most of them, are trivial in nature. In all, about 1,900 instances, the Samaritan Pentateuch, when it disagrees with the Masoretic Text, agrees with the Septuagint. But some of the variants of the Samaritan Pentateuch were obviously deliberate alterations introduced by the Samaritans in the interest of legitimizing their own doctrinal and cultic distinctions. For instance, the Samaritan Pentateuch contends that Mount Gerizim, near Shechem, is the place that God chose to have his name reside when the people entered the promised land and conquered it. Of course, in the Masoretic text, that is not Mount Gerizim near Shechem, but is Mount Moriah near Jerusalem as the site that God chose for the erection of his temple. So while the Samaritan Pentateuch has some value for pre-Masoretic studies, its value, again, is very, very limited. And third, then, we have, as we mentioned before, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, an Arab shepherd boy who was out looking for a lost goat stumbled onto a cave in the Wadi Qumran. That's a dry creek bed at the north end of the Dead Sea. And that cave contained ancient manuscripts that were hidden in earthenware jars. When they were excavated, altogether some 13 caves in the Wadi Qumran yielded fragments of about 600 ancient manuscripts. Some of them were biblical texts, some of them were documents from various Jewish sects. For instance, the ascetic religious community of probably Essenes that lived at Qumran Much of this literature was their own specific religious literature. But every Old Testament book except Esther is represented among the manuscripts and fragments from the Qumran caves. And all scientific evidence places the date of the Dead Sea Scrolls in a time period between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Again, 1,000 years older than the Masoretic Text of the Old Testament. And the collective evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls yields overwhelming confirmation of the accuracy of the Masoretic Text. Scholars agree that the tiny amount of variation between the texts, separated by 1,000 years of manual transmission, is nothing short of remarkable. The Dead Sea Scrolls tell us that the Masoretic scribes were among the finest scribes and the finest textual critics known to human history. In the places where the Dead Sea Scrolls do reveal a degree of variation with the Masoretic text, they show a significant level of agreement with the Septuagint. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain varying degrees of manuscript evidence in support of all three of the known Hebrew text families: the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Manuscripts agreeing with all three of those have been found in the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The verdict on the Old Testament is that the comparative evidence of all the known textual evidence that we have reveals a word-for-word identity between the sources in 95% of the text. And the remaining 5% consists mainly of slips of the pen, discrepancies in spelling, things like that. We have learned through the process of textual criticism that the Masoretes held a deep reverence for the scriptures, and the Masoretic text has remained and deserves to remain the standard text for Old Testament study and translation into the 21st century and beyond. We're going to stop at this point. In our next lesson, we'll be taking a similar look at the manuscript evidence for the New Testament. And I hope that you'll be able to join us at that time. Thank you very much. God bless you and have a great week.